Jeff Beck, among the most innovative and certainly the most unpredictable of 60s guitar heroes, died on Tuesday. He was 78. On behalf of his family, it is with deep and profound sadness that we share the news of Jeff Beck's passing. After suddenly contracting bacterial meningitis, he peacefully passed away yesterday, reads a statement from his rep. His family asked for privacy while they process this tremendous loss. Beck recently completed a tour supporting his collaborative album with Johnny Depp, 18. He received 7 Grammys for instrumental performances, and an 8th for his 2009 work on Herbie Hancock's The Imagine Project. A fleet, imaginative soloist, Beck brought formidable instrumental firepower to British band the Yardbirds, which he joined in 1965 as a replacement for Eric Clapton. Entirely at home with the group's blues roots, he burnished their pop hits with an adventurous and virtually unprecedented use of feedback, sustain and fuzz. After a precipitous exit from the Yardbirds, where he had been joined by another future guitar star, Jimmy Page, he established his own band, the Jeff Beck Group, which was fronted by vocalist Rod Stewart, soon to become a solo star. The unit proved as unstable as it was powerful, and lasted for just 2 albums. During the 70s, Beck assembled a second, more R&B-oriented edition of his group, and briefly formed a short-lived power trio with bassist Tim Bogert and drummer Carmine Appice of Vanilla Fudge and Cactus. He reached the probable apex of both his critical and commercial success with a pair of mid-70s all-instrumental albums, Blow by Blow and Wired, that found him moving into jazz fusion terrain. The latter LP was recorded with keyboardist Jan Hammer, formerly of the top fusion act the Mahavishnu Orchestra. From the early 80s onward, the temperamental Beck, a notorious perfectionist in the studio and a prickly band mate, would sporadically reappear, retrench, retire, and reappear again. His latter-day work ranged from an homage to rockabilly singer Gene Vincent to instrumental sets reflecting the influence of techno, electronica, and ambient music. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice. Acknowledged as a member of the Yardbirds in 1992, he said in a brief speech, "They kicked me out, fuck them." He entered the hall as a solo performer in 2009. Beck was born in Wallington, Surrey. He began playing guitar in his teens, on a homemade model, which he constructed in emulation of one of his heroes, the American guitarist-inventor Les Paul. His idols included Gene Vincent's lead guitarist Cliff Gallup and American bluesman Buddy Guy and Otis Rush. In a striking coincidence, 3 of the greatest guitarists of the rock era, Clapton, Beck and Page, the latter 2 became friends in their early teens after being introduced by Beck's sister, grew up within 15 miles of each other. Like many young British musicians, he was drawn to blues and R&B, and his first bands, The Night Shift, The Rumbles, The Tridents, all drew from the classic American repertoire. His break came in 1965, when Clapton, impatient with the Yardbirds' increasingly pop-oriented, experimental bent, exited the group to join John Mayall's purist unit the Bluesbreakers. On the recommendation of Jimmy Page, who had declined to quit his lucrative session work for a regular guitar chair, the Yardbirds hired Beck, and almost immediately he began putting his stamp on their sound. He delivered dramatic solos on several clamorous Yardbirds hits of 1965 to 66, Heart Full of Soul, number 9 in the US, I'm a Man, number 17, Shapes of Things, number 11, and Over Under Sideways Down, number 13. The band's 66 UK album Yardbirds, familiarly known as Roger the Engineer, after the title of rhythm guitarist Chris Drage's cover drawing, was a veritable recital of forward-looking guitar technique. After bassist and musical director Paul Samwell Smith's exit in early 1966, Page finally joined the Yardbirds on bass, but he soon switched instruments with Drage. The Beck-Page iteration of the band lasted a matter of months and produced only 2 tracks featuring that fearsome twin lead lineup, the single Happenings 10 Years Time Ago and Stroll On, a rewrite of The Train Kept a Rollin' penned for Michelangelo Antonioni's indictment of swinging London, Blow Up. The Yardbirds appeared on screen in Antonioni's feature, with Beck destroying his guitar on stage a la The Who's Pete Townsend. Issues of professionalism and physical and emotional health precipitated Beck's exit from the Yardbirds in 1966. Under Page's leadership, the group would morph, with new members, into Led Zeppelin 2 years later. By early 1967, Beck had recorded the British hit Hi-Ho Silver Lining, which he almost immediately disavowed, and formed a new group with former Steam Packet vocalist Stewart, guitarist-turned-bassist Ron Wood and drummer Mickey Waller. Session pianist Nicky Hopkins also took a prominent role in the studio. Billed to Beck alone, the stormy debut album Truth, 1968, was a forceful brew of hard rock, blues, and folk that provided the basic blueprint for heavy metal to come. Its successor Beckola, 1969, billed to the Jeff Beck Group, with Tony Newman replacing Waller, and featuring 2 crunching Elvis Presley covers and the searing instrumental Rice Pudding, was even more potent. The group, minus Stewart, also backed Brit Folky Donovan on his rocking single Barra Badgigal. But the act proved as volatile a mix as the Yardbirds, and Stewart and Wood left to join the Faces, a reconfigured edition of the mod group The Small Faces, in mid-69. After Beck declined an invitation to replace Brian Jones in the Rolling Stones, a fractured skull sustained in a December 1969 car accident put the guitarist's proposed trio with Americans Bogert and Appice on the back burner. At the turn of the decade, the guitarist founded a new quintet edition of the Jeff Beck Group that leaned heavily on the jazzy keyboard work of Max Middleton. Though the band's albums Rough and Ready, 1971, and its self-titled 1972 follow-up performed respectably, they were largely considered inferior to the records produced by the Stewart Wood lineup. Freed from their obligations to Cactus, Bogert and Appice joined Beck for tour appearances in 1972. By late that year, the unit had been pared down to the power trio Beck, Bogert and Appice. The act issued its lone album in 1973, peaking at number 12 in the US. It featured a hammering rendition of Superstition, which had been custom-written for Beck by its author, Stevie Wonder. A 1973 appearance at David Bowie's famous Ziggy Stardust farewell concert was excluded from the 1983 film and album of the show, but included, nearly 50 years after the show took place, in Brett Morgen's 2022 Bowie documentary, Moonage Daydream. According to legend, Beck would not sign off on the footage because he didn't like the pants he wore on stage, although that story may be apocryphal. However, the performance, which saw him joining Bowie for versions of Jean Genie and a cover of Chuck Berry's Around and Around, is not among his best. Beck next undertook a stylistic about-face that would more or less define his approach for the rest of his career. Parting ways with Bogert and Appice before a sophomore album was completed, he cut an all-instrumental set, Blow by Blow, 1975, with the Beatles' longtime producer George Martin. The Lean Quartet session, a showcase for the leader's considerable virtuosity, ascended to number 4 in America and was ultimately certified for sales of 1 million.